Welcome back. Today I want to lead you into the more complex contemplation of what higher consciousness is and how it feels like when you connected with it, and perhaps also what it can do for you as a spiritual seeker. In this time when everything seems to come to an end and our fears are clouding our perception, it is not only common but also healthy to turn inward and connect with the cycles of nature and life itself. Do not be afraid of what you feel when you connect with your inner truths. As we enter our inner world without prejudice, we can recognize that there is a greater balance that weaves through all cycles: karma, purpose, expression, a higher order. We intuitively understand that everything, every action, every word, every thought, and every sentiment has consequences. Consequences in the material as well as, we forget this sometimes, spiritual world. But we struggle with making sense of them. We fight against injustice and suffering and often judge others and ourselves, and thus tend to see the world and its greater order as separated from ourselves. We forget that as individuals as well as collective, we are creating energetic fields and resonances by congregating and aligning ourselves with a particular notion or thought or judgment. The question is, what kind of field is that? Will we be judged for that? In the old days, the witnesser of all that we express in a lifetime, or perhaps several lifetimes, was portrayed as the divine judge or divine judgment. But it taught us to fear the wrath of God, karma, or judgment day, and made us hateful and unforgiving of ourselves sometimes. To mitigate or cope with this fear of inner and outer judgment, our ego got ignited to form a version of ourselves beyond that judgment, an idealized version of ourselves, different from who we truly are. Today, we understand this in a more differentiated way, but we're still struggling with unifying ourselves with our judgments. We fear outer judgment and don't recognize how it fragments and separates us from our inner power to feel when something is true, good, loving, or expensive for us. If we can embrace our inner spiritual awareness, though, we can learn that there is a witnessing of our actions, thoughts, and alignments that happens in the spirit world through us. Life is not an audition for the afterlife, but an active process of co-creating. But instead of connecting with this inner higher power to see the greater cycles of all that exists and discover the true power of higher consciousness, we torture ourselves with questions such as, what is our destiny and our purpose? What is our karma? What will happen to us after our physical death? Will the world continue to exist? You see, there is a lower and a higher perspective, and with it, a lower and a higher perception of what these cycles of life and this greater balance in the universe is. The higher perspective is guided by our spiritual self. We can connect with it when we choose to see ourselves as a soul with a body as opposed to a body with a soul, as we've learned already. It is the part in us that is not bound to space and time and is therefore able to freely access higher consciousness at all times. Judgment is based on our ego constructs and perspectives. It is bound to the perception of who judges, our unified higher self or our separated lower self. If we choose to connect with the limitations of our smaller or ego consciousness alone, which can only see the smaller cycles of one lifetime, then we must assume that there are things we cannot see. With this understanding that there is a greater balance, a greater cycle that needs to be maintained, we can learn to trust that there is a higher order that guides everything there is. If you were asking yourself now how you can see what you cannot see, then you're still with me. How can we learn to take on the larger perspective and thus become able to make sense of the things that seemingly separate us? Again, there is a long and a short way, but it is quite simple actually. Today's empowerment message is a message of hope. It speaks to the part in you that knows that there is a greater reality and that we all can access it. If we become willing to accept that our ego perspective is small, limited, filtered and restricted, like the awareness level of a spiritual child. Just because we cannot grasp the enormity of the power that works through us doesn't mean it's not there. When we grow up from being a child and become a teenager and then a young adolescent and finally an adult with our full capacity as human, we don't look back and judge ourselves for acting like a child, do we? We can look back and love ourselves regardless. This is the power of higher consciousness flowing through you. I love myself regardless of my flaws, imperfections and shortcomings, because I know that I am a spirit being on my way to expanding my consciousness. I trust that there is a higher order that guides everything there is. I am aware of this greater reality and trust that my higher consciousness guides me through my blindness. If I knew better, I would do better. But in order to know better, I need to understand first. And to understand better, I need to connect within and allow higher consciousness to dissolve all limitations of my ego first. so that I can begin to understand what my ego cannot know. Thank you, everybody, for joining today's empowerment message. Please share in our comments what you have experienced, perhaps as your ego limitation. I'm curious. Stay conscious.